That was Jeff Bridges and Colin Farrell singing Fallin' and Flyin' from the movie Crazy Heart. And yes, I do mean that Colin Farrell. Alright, and they were introducing the topic of the day, which is migration, and specifically migration in birds who fly very long distances sometimes. And one of the things that these little migrants have to figure out before they head off is where they're going to go. And different individuals within a species may have different behaviors, and that's something I've talked about before when I mentioned, for instance, the blackpolls that will sometimes migrate to England and other times migrate down to Spain. A different habitat, a different habit that we see because of the availability of artificial food sources here in the UK. And the other reasons why you might have different behaviors is that you've simply got different types of birds that are capable of or interested in different things. So you might have good versus poor quality individuals, males versus females, older versus younger birds, all that sort of thing, kind of changing the cost balance, the cost and benefit equation for this particular activity. And although there are flyways, which is basically a path that you know that you're going to see migrants on every year, actually we used to think that this is what all birds would follow, that there were lots of different flyways that a bird would learn, and then we would always see these aggregations of birds, and that they didn't really occur anywhere else. And now we know actually that although there are flyways that are quite predictably and reliably used, there are also lots of other pathways that birds kind of, I don't know if it's spontaneous or if it's just ones that we haven't really discovered yet, or if it's just kind of a matter of a few birds do it and pass it on. Genetically, it's an innate thing to their young. We don't really know yet, but there are lots of other pathways that we weren't previously aware of. In terms of actually finding a route during a given migration event, as opposed to just the overall pathways that we see among lots of different migration events, there are lots of different things that birds can do to navigate. So they can use cues like geographical landmarks, the polarization of light, astronomical landmarks like planets and the moon and stars and the sun. They can also learn routes from other birds. They might also, even in some birds, use odors. We see this in lots of different animals. Even salmon seem to use odors when they're migrating. So there are all sorts of things that these animals are picking up from the environment, and that helps them kind of figure out where they need to go. And animals do have an internal compass that will accurately align itself to the appropriate direction, even in unfamiliar habitats. And this is sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, and so this can help some birds when they're migrating. In terms of navigating, this is the idea of the ability to find a specific location from a known starting point. And this involves an internal map, plus the ability to orient. And so different birds have different combinations of these things that help them get to where they're going. And actually, although this has been studied quite well in some species, in general it's not a topic that's really well understood. And people are pursuing this even as we speak. They're trying to figure out what it is that helps birds orient and navigate. And actually one of the things that first cued people into the idea that birds did have this kind of built inherent desire to go in a certain direction was something called migratory restlessness. And this was noticed in captive birds that were held usually as pets. But you would see, for instance, a little canary or a little finch at a certain time of year, of the spring or the fall, it would start to orient in a certain direction and get very restless and try to, go wherever it was that it was facing in the cage. And it was quite clear that these birds wanted to go somewhere. And by looking at this and by using blindfolds and by disrupting the magnetic field around cages, people have begun to figure out how it is that birds are able to find different directions and why it is that they feel pulled in a certain direction at a particular time of year. So how is it that bird bodies actually accomplish this feat of flying? Well, obviously this has a lot to do with aerodynamics, and these are the demands of getting off the ground and then also staying in the air. And aerodynamics is influenced by two things primarily, and that's lift and drag. So lift is the force that will get a bird off the ground and keep it in the air, and that's produced by air moving around and past an airfoil. And in this case, the airfoil is the wing, and the shape of the wing is what helps produce lift. So specifically, you've got air that flows over the top and over the bottom, and they have to meet at the same time. But given the fact that the wing is curved, you have air on the top that has farther to travel within the same period of time, and that means that it needs to move more quickly. And so that faster moving air on top results in lower air pressure above the wing and then below it, and that's what helps the bird move up in the air and stay up, and that's the lift. And the feathers are used to transform the wing into an airfoil. So each feather itself is a little tiny airfoil, and then cumulatively they cover the wing and create one large airfoil as well. Now drag is something that reduces lift by slowing the air moving over the wing. And you've got structure, again, and alignment of the feathers that are helping to reduce the drag and prevent birds from being slowed down too much. Although this is also what they use whenever they go into land. So you'll see that birds will flap their wings out and kind of angle them in a different orientation, and that's what they use to deliberately slow to a certain amount so that when they come in for a landing, they're not going to just crash and go sliding across the ground. Although there are some birds that are very bad at manipulating their wings and landing, and so you can actually see some pretty terrible crash landings. I've seen those on David Attenborough before. And actually all these things I'm talking about you'll probably recognize if you've ever flown on an airplane. So these are the same principles that help an airplane get up into the air and stay there. So the next time you're on a flight you can kind of look out the window at the wings and notice how in many ways there are similarities with bird wings. So how does aerodynamics influence migration? Well, migrating birds, have more of what's called primary projection than non-migrants, and that means that their wings are longer and they're more pointed. And this makes it easier for them to produce, this helps minimize air resistance, but it doesn't sacrifice lift. And so it just gives them a better balance between drag and lift. And you also find that migratory efficiency is going to be most impacted by the strength and the direction of the wind. So it's actually the prevailing conditions that are really going to impact how aerodynamic a bird is. So as I said earlier, birds will actively choose to migrate at certain times that have more appropriate wind conditions, whether that's the strength of the wind or the direction of the wind. And once they get aloft, they will select particular altitudes in order to minimize the amount of headwind, which is acting against them, or maximize the amount of tailwind that's going to be helping them out. And this is another one of the reasons that we find birds flying in flocks. As you probably already know, flocks can improve aerodynamics, and individual birds can potentially gain up to 40% energy, or they're using 40% less energy whenever they are utilizing the aerodynamics from the flock. And so that's one of the things that we see causing this V-shaped flight, and you'll have the lead birds trading off with the other birds so that everyone kind of evens out who's bearing the brunt of the burden there. Now migrants also tend to select the most efficient flight speeds given their size, style of flight, and environmental conditions. So birds will they kind of know instinctively and by feeling what it is that they need to do at any given time in order to make their trip possible. So you see ducks and geese, for example, going up to 40 or 50 miles per hour, whereas small songbirds might only fly for 15 to 30 miles per hour. For migrants that are going across open bodies of water, you can find them having to fly for many, many miles straight. So things like hummingbirds, for example, in the US, have to fly across the Gulf of Mexico all in one go. And that can require 500 miles straight. And if you want to put that in perspective of time, you have some migrants that will fly up to 70 hours in a row. So thrushes and warblers will do this. And the ability to manage these types of flight, it's going to be, obviously you have to have lots and lots of energy. So the ability to do this all really boils down to how much fat you have been able to store prior to your departure. Now, fat is the best fuel because it produces more than twice as much energy as things like proteins or carbohydrates. And so that's why birds are trying to get things like nuts that are high in oil and fat. And these are quite easy to store throughout the body as well, so you can put them in organs, you can put them in cavities within the body. And if you actually ever see a bird up close and you blow its feathers out of the way, you can see the little pockets of fat. For example, they tend to put on fat underneath their wings and in their armpits, and you can see these little kind of yellowish looking collections underneath the very thin skin of the bird, and that's where they're putting on fat stores. And another nice thing about fat is that as you metabolize it, it produces a lot of water. And when you've got a lot of extra water in the body, that means that you're not going to be as likely to succumb to dehydration. And birds have to put on tons of body fat before they migrate, to the extent that some of them will even double their body weight before they take off. Sorry, I think I may have just misspoken. They need to put on tons of body fat before migrating in order to double their body weight. So shorebirds, for instance, might put on as much as 66% body fat prior to taking off. And this is particularly common in these birds that are going from the Arctic down south, for instance, to South America. Songbirds might have as much as 70% body fat. Things like hawks, they need a little bit less because they can use a lot more of the wind, and so they have about 15% body fat. And one of the most amazing stats, again referring to hummingbirds, is that these guys normally weigh about 3 grams, and they might add 2 grams of fat to that. So 2/3 of their body weight they're putting back on in the form of fat. And actually, scientists have worked out how you can convert an animal's fat content to figure out about how far it can fly. So this is obviously going to be given ideal flight conditions. You can't factor in all these different things that might happen that you don't know about ahead of time. But if you've got 10% body fat, then theoretically you should be able to fly 300 to 500 miles at a go. And that's 10 or 20 hours of flight time. But if you put on 50% body fat, then that means you could theoretically go 1,800 to 2,500 miles in one go. And that's 3 or 4 days of solid flight. And you do actually see birds doing this. Now, as you might expect, by the time the trip is done, they're totally exhausted. They'll have burned through most or all of their stores, and might even have started burning through other things as well, like muscle. And they're exhausted by the time that they reach their destination. And again, this is one of the reasons that we see fallout as well. It's not just a matter of weather, but just kind of reaching the end of what they have to give. And so you'll find certain places that are really common fallout zones for birds during migration. So in the US, for example, Texas is a really good spot because you've got all the birds coming up from South America. And Cape May, New Jersey, there on the East Coast is another example because you've got birds that come up across the water and along the coast during migration. And these are spots where birders go every year. This is why the Isles of Scilly is so popular, is that you just have these huge aggregations of birds that plop down as soon as they see land, and they just try to eat everything that they can find. And sometimes they're so tired they'll even land directly on people and just sit there. And an example of this is, again, the red knot, that guy that flies all the way from Brazil up to the Arctic. When it makes its stop in Delaware Bay, it's usually gone from about 66% body fat down to 3%. And they have to then consume more food in order to gain fat to fuel that final leg of the trip. And this is something that's been really important in a conservation sense, because you've got these refueling stations that are really important to species like the red knot, but in modern times they often don't have the same conditions that they evolved under. So they might not have as much food, they might not have the amount of food that they need once they get there, or there would be enough food if there weren't as many of them, but the food resources have been diminished, and so now they're competing more with each other. Or maybe the trees have been cut down and houses have been put in, so they don't have a place to roost. And this is a big issue because you've got all these birds that show up and desperately need more, and if they can't get more food or more rest, then they're going to die before they can complete migration and then breed. And this is not the only thing that interferes with migration. You also have problems with loss of the non-breeding ranges in the southern hemisphere because sites are becoming more and more developed in these formerly third world countries. You've got habitat fragmentation. That means that the birds will have patches that they can migrate through effectively, but then they kind of reach maybe a big road or a big suburb or something, and suddenly they run into a tower, or they don't have food to fuel the next stop, or whatever the problem is. It's just that their habitats are all patched up and they can't make it from one of those little islands to the next one. And then another huge problem is death by humans. And that's not just inadvertent death, like these birds that fly into towers, for example, but things like hunting. And this is a real problem in the Mediterranean with the hunting. In South America, there's a real problem with pesticide use, where farmers think that the birds are going to eat all of their crops, even if they aren't, and so they'll leave out pesticides that kill them even when they're not eating those foods. And so one of the things that's a big worry now about migration is that this huge event that's so energetically costly and so sensitive is going to be negatively influenced by people. And there are lots and lots of drives by the BTO or BirdLife International, for example, to help out and make migration an easier process for lots of birds. And actually, I will post some links to that on the website when I update it, hopefully later today. And I will put other things as well, for instance, some images of migrating birds and exciting things that have to do with migration, migrating sites, for example. And I will post also a list of the songs. I do this every week. And I just want to mention one last thing before I put up my final song of the day. And that's Stanley, who will be coming in here next, has informed me that I have made some factual errors in some of my previous shows. And I hate to hear that because I don't want to be misleading any of you guys. So if you guys hear any problems, anything that I say wrong, do let me know and I will try to correct it either on air or on the website. And as I read through the sources that Stanley has given me to bring me up to speed, I will post some corrections for sure on the Wildside website. So definitely check that out and log in and let me know what you think of the show and give me some suggestions for future topics. And that is all for today. I'm going to end with a little bit of Chris Isaak singing Flying.